Notre Dame fans, welcome to a special edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. This is a recruiting edition. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com, and I'm joined today by the director of recruiting for SI All-American, my man, John Garcia Jr. John, thanks so much for being with us and coming on to talk about Notre Dame recruiting.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Yeah, the Irish got things cooking, as the kids say. So it's always good to check in and get a fresh look at the future of this program.
So they've been kind of hot lately. Got a couple solid offensive commits: Steve Angeli at quarterback, and Maureen Walker at wide receiver. And then the defensive staff said, "Okay, it's our turn now," and they upped the ante a little bit, getting, in my opinion, one of the best cover players on the West Coast, and one of the very best linebackers in the entire nation. Of course, that would be Jaden Mickey, the cornerback from Centennial High School out near L.A., and Josh Burnham, the linebacker slash athlete slash quarterback slash basketball player from Traverse City Central up in Michigan, John. So we're going to talk about those two players, what you think of those two players on film, what they add to the Notre Dame class. And then there's about 5 other defensive players, mainly DB, because that's where you and I love to chat, is about defensive back. And we're going to talk about some of the top skill players on the board for Notre Dame on defense. So let's first start with, I'm a quarterback guy, receiver guy, you're a DB guy, right? We can break it all down, but that's our passion, that's our heart. So I'm gonna throw you a bone here. We're gonna start talking about DBs, John, and I first want to talk about Jaden Mickey, and again from Centennial High School out in Corona, California, out near LA. Listed to 5'11", 175. We have not seen him play his junior season yet because his junior season got canceled, and they don't start till next week, his junior season. So we're going off sophomore film and some camp stuff. That's where he is at. So, John, let's dive right into Jaden Mickey. You've broken down the film. What's some of the first things that jump out to you when you study his film of this Notre Dame commit?
It's about the production, Brian. I think when me and you talk rankings, prospects, parameters all the time, right? So we talk about certain positions. We like to jump right into production, and that's usually reserved for offense, right? Well, his completion percentage was above 70, and he threw for 4,000 yards, or this kid averaged 9 yards a carry, or this receiver averaged 18 yards a catch. It shows you his production. How about 6 interceptions as a sophomore playing in that league? Now, for those who don't know, he's at Centennial. This is the modern day league. That alone, if you're a football fan, should indicate something. You should have a little ping going on in the back of your head, like, oh, modern day, Bryce Young, those guys. Oh, okay, yeah, all these quarterbacks that have come through there, national champs, the only school to beat IMG, blah, blah, blah. It goes down the list. Well, Jaden played great against modern day, but it wasn't even, it was just a blip on his radar. 6 interceptions in 2019. Production from a corner is not something we typically talk about because either they're thrown away from or it's hard to track their actual stats. But 6 interceptions tells you a lot. And then when you watch the film, you see a bunch of that. And looking at the play where he intercepted Bryce Young, who was, before we did the SI 99, but he would have been our number 1 guy in that first year. He was the first team quarterback on the SI All-American team, now at Alabama, probably the starter going forward, etc. He baited him. He completely baited him, and the defense was designed for him to play in trail position and make Bryce Young throw over the top. He maintained that inside leverage, turn at the appropriate time, right at the mesh point, and was stride for stride with Young's target. Young saw outside leverage available and threw the vertical, only to have Mickey step in front of it and really accelerate at the right point. So in one clip, you get kind of the full gamut of this kid. First of all, understands defense and concepts, right? He needed to maintain that inside leverage where he aligned pre-snap, where Bryce Young's already indicating, okay, if I want this 9 route to the outside, I've got a chance with my guy one-on-one versus yours. And then you have to execute. He was in phase the entire time. Obviously, when the football was in the air, he tracked it and hauled it in against a fellow Power 5 type of wide receiver. So that was really the play that I was like, okay, let me watch more here. And then you see the rest of that production show up. He's really comfortable with leverage, as we mentioned. He's probably more of a zone corner at this stage, but again, as we'll talk about with a couple of these California or West Coast guys, Brian, we hadn't seen him in a long time. So that 5'11", 175 could very well be 6 foot and much bigger than 175, which could eventually enable him to do more things. I don't think he was asked to do a whole lot as a sophomore, and other teams maybe saw that youth as a weakness, and he exploited them for 6 picks in like 11 games. That's just something that's unheard of in any league. So I really like where he is at based off of that sophomore film, and I'm really eager to see what he looks like going forward. But he checks several boxes. He's a willing run supporter. He can play that offhand jam. He can contribute at the line of scrimmage. Much more comfortable off at this point, it seems like. But again, that dated film, leaves a lot of room for filling in the gaps. So Mickey's a good player on tape, and I'm even more curious to see how he is live and progress some 12, 15 months later.
When you go back and you look at his sophomore season, that game against Mater Dei was his first game. His first game of the year. So they didn't know who they were going at yet.
Unbelievable.
And then he has another pick the next week against Lawrence Lutheran, and teams kind of stopped throwing at him as much. But as you said, still had 6 interceptions. They also played St. John Bosco that year, who was the only team to actually beat Mater Dei that season. So,
and that was DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback, right? Notre Dame, that's definitely not him. So
that's right.
Yeah.
The thing I liked about him too, John, he was listed at like 155 as a sophomore. He is not afraid to come up and stick. Again, he's not a guy that's going to be laying people out like Sean Taylor, but I loved his competitiveness and willingness to come up a hit. And you tell me what you think about this comp, John. When I look at him and you say, people like comps, I'm not a huge fan of it, but people like it, so let's do it. It helps them kind of process what we're talking about. The comp for me that I see when I think of Jaden Mickey is former Notre Dame All-American Julian Love. What I mean by that is he's never going to be a 4.41 guy. I don't see Jaden Mickey ever being a pure speed guy, but I think he's a flat-out excellent cover player because he's a top-notch athlete, but he's also incredibly instinctive and, to your point, productive. Julian Love ran a mid-4.5 at the Pro Day, which is why, as a consensus All-American, he was taken in the 4th round, when you look at all his production, because he's not a fast guy. I see a lot of that in Jaden Mickey. He's never going to win a track meet, which is why I don't think he's ever going to be like a top 50 to top 100 recruit, but the kid just makes plays. And you can play him in the slot. You can play him outside. Really diverse, talented, but productive player. What are your thoughts on that comparison, John?
I like it. It's, you have your freaks, your athletes, and you have your football players. Give me the football players. Give me the guys in this category who, they're not going to test out the wazoo, but if the first thing you're pointing at is production and you're seeing value at what, frankly, is the hardest thing to do on the football field besides, in my opinion, besides playing quarterback is turning and running with a receiver where you are not the intended target. It sounds so simple when you look at it that way, but to be able to do that again against this level of competition successfully at such a young age is just so intriguing. So I like that. Like you said, Love was kind of underappreciated coming out of the NFL draft because he wasn't this super twitchy, bouncy 40-inch vertical type guy. And that's okay for the NFL, but for what we're looking for, production matters so much more at this position. Just guys who can play the football. We've talked about this a lot. We just mentioned Uiagalelei. He threw for 1 billion yards against Notre Dame, but guess what? Notre Dame won this game because they made plays at the catch point when it mattered. That's football in 2021. It's a little bit of 7-on-7. It's not about the corner who's going to run 4-4 and eliminate one half the field. That doesn't really exist anymore. You will get challenged basically at every turn. So the guys who are productive with that, and as you mentioned, first game against Bryce Young, and you're picking the guy off when he's clearly targeting you, that tells me as much about Mickey as more than a height and weight and 40 time will ever tell me about this kid.
Notre Dame also got a commitment from a linebacker, Josh Burnham, from Traverse City Central High School in Traverse City, Michigan. Young man that grew up as a Michigan fan. So for Notre Dame and Notre Dame fans to go into Michigan, get a kid that grew up as a fan of the Wolverines, a guy that Michigan really wanted, a top 100 caliber talent, SI99 caliber talent, in my view. We'll be having a conversation about that as we get closer and closer to those releases. But this is a 6'4", 215-pound, incredibly long player that to me is just scratching the surface of how good I think he can be because he plays so many different things. You popped on the film, John. You took a look at this kid. What do you think of Josh Burnham, Notre Dame's latest commitment?
And this is the most unique kid we'll talk about tonight in my mind for what we do. We talked about production with Mickey, and I think, the production versus projection argument is something that will probably never die. But man, if we're playing the projection game, this is the kid we could spend the whole show talking about. You mentioned 6'4", what is it, 215, 220, whatever it is. He doesn't have a position. He's a great basketball player, quarterback. He's catching passes. He's playing linebacker. Just a kid who can turn and run and make plays, but really doesn't know what he is yet positionally. That polish we talk about at certain positions is not there yet. He's not scraping to the right hole with great efficiency and knowledge of blocking schemes or anything like that, which means when he's making plays, he's just making plays. This is a natural athlete. The instincts here are off the charts. And as you mentioned, 6'4", that lengthy frame can now all of a sudden start to make you think of a lot of 3-down possibilities. Can he rush the passer? Can he drop in coverage? Again, he's catching touchdowns on offense when he's not running them in from the quarterback spot. So we know the ball skills and the comfort is there with the football in the air. He has the athleticism to play in space. He has the athleticism to play the football. And that creates a ton of intrigue. But, even if at a very sort of micro level, he could see ball, get ball, and come downhill and make a play. So I think at a minimum, you're getting a very consistent contributor, but at a maximum and all stars aligning conversation, you're getting a guy who offensive coordinators will literally have to identify pre-snap every single play, because I think he's one of these monster backs that we're going to start talking about in this industry that are positionless defensive players. They're starting to get paid like that in the NFL. Think of a Buda Baker type for the Arizona Cardinals, Isaiah Simmons at Clemson the last few years. These monster backs are positionless freaks of nature that you don't know what they're going to do on a given snap. So at Notre Dame, Josh Burnham's going to have that sort of NBC snap count tracker. He lined up at linebacker 26 times, at pass rusher 25 times. He's at safety. He's going to do everything, and I'm so all in intrigued with Josh Burnham, and he's one of those guys that I'm going to check in on consistently because we just don't know where he's going to end up, and I think it's a huge victory for Notre Dame, no matter how you look at it.
For me, John, he is the kind of kid that this is exactly why I came up with my 2 grading system, which is a grade for where a kid is right now. And to me, he's a top 100 caliber, SI 99 caliber player. But the upside grade is that it's as good as it's an elite. It's elite. He is a guy that you look at and say, he has a lower floor than another linebacker we're going to talk about tonight because of the fact he's so raw. But if he hits his ceiling, you're talking about a first-round NFL draft pick in an era where linebackers don't get drafted much in the first round anymore. That's the kind of ceiling. Now, how far he'll go between now and then remains to be seen. But this is a coach's dream, John. You say, okay, length, check. Athleticism, check. Great frame, check. Smart intangibles leader, check. Production, check. I mean, it's all there. It's just now it's okay. Now I got to ball them. It's this big ball of clay that I got to mold. And sometimes, you and I were talking about something off the air, John, and you say, coaches love those guys that they don't have all these bad habits from 4 years of playing 7-on-7, 4 years of this linebacker coach that, coached him to play the game exactly this way. That's not what we do. He's a big ball of clay that everything is going to be kind of new to him because he isn't that refined technician at linebacker like a Manti Te'o. He's more of a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah where he's moving all over than he is a Manti Te'o that you look and say, great player, pure Mike. This isn't that kind of guy.
No, I mean, he could, in 2 years, Brian, he could be the best edge guy on Notre Dame's roster.
If he fills out with that frame, absolutely.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me at 6'4", 215. And what we're seeing with we don't use the NFL as our model, but we do take trends from there to evolve our evaluations, right? You should always be learning, growing, all that fun stuff. One thing that's really starting to translate with second level defenders, so you're talking inside backers, off ball backers, and even some stand up edge guys, there is some offense defensive translation here that is really starting to pick up in terms of projecting these elite athletes. Guys go in the first round. A lot of them played a lot of offense in high school. That's not something we saw earlier, in the aughts, early 2010s. We didn't see a lot of that. We always talked about it at wide receiver with defensive back and vice versa. But now that whole running back to linebacker deal is starting to pick up a lot of steam, and Burnham plays all over the field. He's a good basketball player too. So I think this is a football player with untapped potential. And like you said, this is what you want as a coaching staff. You want the chance to develop that guy just as much as you want the safe high floor prospects. You got to have a blend of the two. And there's clearly, one side where Burnham, lies pretty high.
Well, this is the kind of guy that Notre Dame has had a lot of success with lately. You look at Jalen Smith, 1,000-yard running back coming out of high school as well, freaky athlete. You look at Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah, was also a wide receiver, wildcat quarterback in high school. He turned out to be pretty decent. And the kid that you guys ranked as Notre Dame's number one signee in the 2021 class, Prince Collie, was a 1,000-yard receiver as a junior, a 1,900-yard running back as a senior, and also a tremendous linebacker. So, to your point, it's what you said earlier, John. Are you looking for measurables? Are you that NFL team that cares more about the combine, or are you that team that cares more about the film? And this is the kind of kid that you look at and say, we'll figure that other stuff out later, but this kid has that combination of both. He's got that stuff you love as a coach, as a combine person. He's got that length, all that. But then he's also just a heck of a football player. And I think that's where you're talking about that new age of second level defender. And if he keeps adding weight and fills out, then like you said, John, then you just tell him to go stand on the edge. And now all of a sudden he's a viper and he's getting after the quarterback. And you can't have enough second level defenders like that. You just can't. I mean, this is the kind of athlete that you need if you're going to be competing for championships, in my opinion.
100%, Brian. We don't rank inside linebacker, outside linebacker. We've got off-ball linebackers and edge. And even there can be a blend. And if there was, it would probably – the conversation would start with Burnham. I'm a big fan. I just think this is the type of win you have to compete with the guys and the programs that Notre Dame has to compete with, right? At this point, Notre Dame and Oklahoma are on this sort of trajectory where it's like the only thing left for us to do is win a playoff game, get to the title game, and finish the job, right? So if you want to compete with the teams that have done that, Ohio State, Bama, Clemson, LSU, Georgia, or not Georgia just yet, but
they've won a playoff game. I mean, they took a championship game to overtime. I'd take that next year.
Right? So those programs have guys like that. Notre Dame needs more of it. It's very clear. Look, defensive recruiting has been awesome. You've been all over that. But to continue that, you need to bring in your Prince Collies. You need to bring in your Josh Burnhams, who are just football players who you will mold into that. And they'll be contributors pretty early, even without that polish. I think you can get away with that a little bit more, to me, on defense than offense.
John, let's stay at linebacker, and we're going to talk about another big target on the board for Notre Dame. And if we talked all these things about Josh Burnham and his versatility and all those kind of things, and let's talk about Junior Tuihalamaka, because to me, he is one of those throwback players. He, to me, is not a guy that has as much versatility. I think he can do two things really well, and one of them is line up in the middle of your defense and dominate the run game. He is another California prospect. Notre Dame is really starting to turn it back up on the West Coast after a few years where they weren't making as much of an effort out there. California's been very good to Notre Dame in recent seasons. This is a prospect that is down to the Final Five of Notre Dame, Texas, Arizona State, Stanford, and I believe Oregon is his other team in his top five. I like where Notre Dame is at right now, John. Let's talk a little bit about what you see from Junior Tuihalamaka and what he brings to the Notre Dame defense, and if you see a similarity between a past Notre Dame linebacker that I see when I watch his film.
Oh, I think I know which one you're going to allude to there. But with Tuihalamaka, I mean, this is the opposite of Burnham. It's like we just talked about. I know you gave that away earlier, but Burnham is I don't know where he's lining up on all three downs, especially on third down. But it's going to be something to note. Tuihalamaka is going to line up inside. He's going to be, probably over a guard, maybe over a tackle if we're getting a little exotic here. But you want him coming downhill because he is your old school, I don't know the kid, but your perceptive, crazy downhill middle linebacker that is there to lead and set a tone. And man, the downhill ability of this kid when it comes to skinning through gaps, coming downhill and taking on a guard, coming downhill at the mesh point, slipping through to the angle, the proper place to meet the ball carrier, everything downhill, even pre-snap and timing when it comes to blitzing and all of that. This kid is off the charts with that. His football instincts to see ball, get ball are very good. This is your blitzing torpedoed. Can't think of any other metaphor. All of those, that's what Junior is. And there's still a place for that. I think, we talk a lot about, okay, what's he going to do on third down? Is he a kid that you might have to pull out on third down in favor of a sub defender, whether it's a pass rusher or a defensive back? That's maybe a conversation for another day. But when you're talking floor and what he does so well, when you think of, a great tone setter in a Notre Dame defense, I think Junior would fit a lot of those things. It's a fun tape to watch. This is the tape that you want to watch out of this group. If you just, you like contact, you like a little violence, you got a little bit of an edge to you, put on Junior's tape and you'll have a little bit of fun watching it. I think the floor here is really the conversation. Doesn't mean he can't get better. Doesn't mean he can't evolve into that third down type of linebacker, but I'll take guys like him on first and second down any day.
And here's another thing that says, we've talked about this, John. This makes the 2022 class even more than the 2021 class really hard to evaluate, is because he's another player who we're going off sophomore film. Correct. Which to me is like that. He looked like that as a sophomore.
It's like probably, again, like with Jaden, what was he asked to do as a sophomore playing in a great state like California? Because I know down in Florida or up in Atlanta, if you got a great athlete that's pretty young, you're not going to ask him to do too much. You don't want to fill his plate up. You want to let him, see ball, get ball if that's what he can do. So that also comes into the conversation and goes right along with what you said. We got a long way to go in this evaluation, even though we have a pretty strong idea of where his floor may be.
Now, here's one thing I did like about him. He is not someone you're going to say, hey, we're going to lock you up on the tight end all game. He's got good length, but he doesn't have like that elite length like we're talking about with Josh Burnham. But one thing I did like about him is he is a really smart zone middle linebacker, a guy that understands how to get up underneath routes, shows good timing, reads quarterbacks well. So, and like you said, there's a role for that in the modern game. I think the other thing that makes him especially a good fit for a place like Notre Dame is because Notre Dame plays as diverse a schedule as any team in the country. One week you're playing a Pac-12 team like USC, who's going to, he's going to be throwing the ball 50, 60 times a game. The next week you're playing Wisconsin. And then a week after that, you're playing North Carolina, who is going to throw it all over the field and has 2,000-yard running backs. And then you play Navy a week after that. You to have a guy like this, to me, that you could say there's going to be weeks where we can't win without a guy like this. And there may be some other weeks where, he's going to be a first and second down monster, but then on third down, we are subbing him out, which Notre Dame has done. Notre Dame did that with Tavon Coney in 2018. I think Tavon, one of the outlets, had him as a second or third team All-American. Yeah. And he came off the field on third down. That's okay. Especially when you look at the athleticism that Notre Dame has been recruiting at linebacker, obviously with Prince Colley, with Josh Burnham, with Nolan Ziegler. So to me, you need a guy like this when you're Notre Dame more than most schools. I think Notre Dame needs a kid like this because they will play Georgia, a home and home with Georgia. They will play Alabama. They will play these teams, whether it's in the postseason or in the regular season. You have to have the ability to go out and match up with those guys. It's not like you're in the Big 12 where you just are recruiting to beat a bunch of, air raid, spread it around, throw it teams. You're going to play a very unique schedule, and a guy like Junior Tuihalamaka is a must get. You have to have at least one of him on your team if you're Notre Dame, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on that, John?
I completely agree. I mean, look at these great teams from the last few years who have either won or gotten to that title game. They've all had that that linebacker who wasn't the guy we talked about in passing situations. James Skalski at Clemson comes to mind. Alabama's had bigger downhill linebackers who aren't asked to cover a lot or are vulnerable in coverage. And again, with giving him the benefit of the doubt, with having not played as an upperclassman yet, maybe that will show up on tape more. Maybe he will be asked to do a little bit more of that. But even if we think we have him pegged, like you said, you play a diverse schedule. That is an excellent point. I think they play as diverse a schedule. They're playing teams coast to coast every year, no matter what, right? So nobody else can really say that. And again, like you said, in the playoff, you're playing teams that at least in theory want to dominate the line of scrimmage. So there is still a place for that. This is a kid that won't be talked about as much if wherever he ends up, but he will show up on Saturdays. And he's a kid you don't recruit for September, you recruit him for December and potentially January when you're playing games in a little bit cooler weather, where the running game is going to be a little bit more emphasized. It's like the NFL playoffs. We all of a sudden see all these running backs making big plays, right? Aaron Jones and Leonard Fournette that we weren't talking about as much in the regular season. Well, it gets a little colder out. You got to rely on the old school game a little bit more. So to combat that, you need your Tuihalamakas.
Yeah, and I mean, you talked about James Skalski on the 2020 and 2019 Clemson team. That Trey Lamar on the 2018 team was a guy like that. He was a guy that you're just hey, look, no one needs to run the ball between the tackles. It's up to you. And I even think there's some merit to having a guy like that when you are playing at USC. And what I mean by that is what the air raid does is it basically says we're going to try to get you to vacate the box. And the more we do that, the more resources you have to commit to the perimeter, then that's going to open up some things we want to do between the tackles, especially the good air raids, the one like North Carolina, the ones that are a little bit more balanced. Well, when you have a guy like Junior Tuihalamaka playing Mike, you're going to be able to defend the run a lot better with a 5-man box than you would if you had more of an athlete, playing that position. So
you'd run right at him.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I do think there's a merit to that. And the thing I'm curious to see now, John, if he, when he plays, because he's going to start his junior season here soon as well.
Right.
I saw a couple clips. We didn't see enough of it to where I can definitely bang my, pound the desk to say this is what he can do. There's a few snaps where he came off the edge, and you say, well, not that you're going to line him up on the edge like Josh Burnham, but my point being, if you're going to keep him on the field on 3 downs, so which when you're playing spread teams, sometimes you're not going to have the option to sub out. Yeah. He's a guy, to your point about that ability to the timing, the ability to get through holes, and that to me that short area burst. He's not a sideline to sideline guy, but his ability to plant and explode for 5 to 7 yards is impressive. That's where you can have him as a role as a blitzer on 3rd down. So, okay, we're not going to ask him to cover because he's not going to run with your slot receiver, but he's going to get after the quarterback. And that's something I saw a little bit of as a sophomore that I really liked, that I'm most looking forward to seeing from him as we get into that junior, senior film, because that's the other way you can be a 3-down player. If you can't go cover people, then you got to get after the quarterback. And I think there's something to that when I watch him play.
Yeah. How will you affect the passing game? And he's a savvy blitzer. There's no doubt about it. I saw him get skinny. I saw him beat the guard at the point of attack, or the point of contact, I should say. He's got those short area intellectual abilities to make the right play, which means if he is rushing the passer, you can present that he can win with speed, or then the counter game and the stunt game to pair with the big guys that Notre Dame will always have on the interior. And now all of a sudden you could create a role for 3rd down. Yeah, 3rd down guys or 3-down guys, it means how are you going to affect the passing game? Because we obviously assume 3rd down is that passing down. And it doesn't have to be in coverage even for linebackers. That's a great point.
And Notre Dame also is going to be doing, I think, more 3-3-5 as we get further away from what, the Clark Lee defense with Marcus Freeman. And that's another reason that you would like to have a thumper, because it's easier for you to insert a 4th guy that's a 230 to 245 guy. He's 230 as a sophomore. I imagine he's going to be 240 plus when it's all said and done. Now all of a sudden you got another bigger body to throw in there. So that's kind of what I see from him. Obviously, Notre Dame still got to close. I know Texas is making a hard push for him. Stanford's making a hard push for him. But right now I like where Notre Dame stands. John, let's talk a little secondary now. We're going to get to I just wanted to distract you for a little bit, talk a little linebacker to distract you. Cornerback, Brian Smith, who does some stuff for both of us, really good talent evaluator, in my opinion. Brian likes to talk about the fact that one of the positions, and I agree with him completely, one of the positions that Notre Dame does, in fact, still have a talent deficiency outside of a 2-year stretch with Julian Love and Troy Pride. Outside of that small stretch, the position where they're still significantly behind the teams that are competing for and winning championships is corner. And I think that last year's class we talked a lot about was a gap narrowing class. They need another one. Jaden Mickey's a great start, but there's a couple guys on the board that I want to talk to you about, because I believe there's some guys on the board for Notre Dame that if they can somehow get those guys, and it's not going to be easy, that is another big gap narrowing pickup for Notre Dame. And we're going to talk two of them because I believe they're on the same 7-on-7 team. I believe they both play for the Bootleggers. The first one for me is my favorite cornerback in this class, partly because of the same reason I love Josh Burnham, and that's Kamari Rogers from Mississippi. Plays at Holmes County in Mississippi. And you want to talk about just a kid that God said when he was born, you're going to cover people. You're going to be a corner. That's why I'm putting you on this earth. That's, to me, Kamari Rogers. Notre Dame has not signed a kid like him since Lou Holtz was the head coach, in my opinion, meaning just an elite player that you out and say, you see that dude right there, that All-American receiver, go cover him. And then you just call it a day. And then you figure out what you're going to do with your other 10. John, when you watch, you've seen him on film, you've seen him in person at 7-on-7s. What are your thoughts on Kamari Rogers? And am I way off base here in my analysis of him?
No, not at all. But I think what's fun about this one, Brian, is that you see it, right? You can tangibly see it, right? The length, the athleticism, the ball skills are all right there. But if you're already feeling like this is one of the best corners in the country, then this should be the number one target for Notre Dame, because he still has a ways to go. He plays a ton of receiver. He's really good at it, by the way. And he's really great in run support. He's got this reckless abandon for his body, despite not being the biggest cat
$160
in the world. Yeah, he's got a little Devontae Smith in him on defense, who also played for the Bootleggers back in the day. But man, this is a legitimate corner, and I think in this evaluation business, look, for us, we've got multiple secondary positions to rank. We rank safeties, we rank corners, we also rank nickels. This is a guy who we would not talk about at any other position than corner. And that might sound like chalk. That might sound like, okay, well, yeah, he's listed at corner. That's what we think he's going to be. That doesn't happen. A lot of the guys who even end up ranked as corners, they're in the murky levels of the conversation with other positions. Take a Sage Ryan from last year, right? An SI 99 prospect signed with LSU over Bama. This is a freaky safety who's one of the fastest players in America. We talked corner, we talked safety. He ended up as a nickel, even though physically he has the traits to play all three. Kamari Rogers is a corner, like you said. He is built to cover other human beings. He is lengthy, very good at the line of scrimmage, despite being so raw. And again, the ball skills. That wide receiver stuff really translates here. And again, that's what it's about. It's not about holding DeAndre Hopkins to 2 catches for 35 yards. It's just not realistic nowadays. It's about limiting him on third down and keeping him out of the end zone. And a Kamari Rogers type will give you a chance to do that against just about any high school prospect right now. And again, that's while his workload is still not 100% even defense, much less corner. So I think that is where you get really excited. It's similarly, so like we talked about with Burnham, you get excited about the projection here, even though what we're seeing productively or production-wise is already very strong. So, plays against great competition. Like you said, 7-on-7 circuit, checks those boxes. We verified those in person. But, man, once this kid polishes up, scary, scary potential.
Now, John, we're going to do the same thing at corner that we did at linebacker. We're going to talk about two prospects that I love that are polar opposites. We talk about, Kamari Rogers is, and Josh Burnham are in that just God-given ability. I cannot wait till the polish gets there because they're tremendous talents. And then there's these guys that you watch and you say, well, that guy looks like he's already in college. We talked about that with Junior Tuihalamaka. And that's how I feel about Jyaire Brown, the cornerback. Now, he's a He's originally he plays at Lakota West in Ohio. Now, I didn't learn, Brian told me this the other day. He's actually originally from, I believe, Louisiana. So he's not a native Ohioan, and that's why he plays on the Bootleggers. So he's an Ohio State commit, but he's still talking to Notre Dame. He, to me, is the epitome of a modern-day boundary corner. Now, if you're still a team that can do that, and Notre Dame is a team that still likes to do that, he is the epitome of a boundary corner, a guy that you just say is big, physical, smart, and can just physically do everything you need a guy to do. This is a really interesting kid and a complete opposite of Kamari Rogers because he's big, he's thick, and he is advanced for a high school junior when it comes to how to play the game. I saw a 7-on-7 game the other day, and he's just talking, and it's just constantly communicating. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to line up here. You got to do this. And it's just like the dude's like a coach out there. You got to love players like that, John.
He's your guy that you'll bring in as a boundary corner, but you'll move him around, and he'll captain your secondary one day from any spot, from the nickel, from the safety, or even as purely that boundary corner. My first three notes here are what you want if you're talking about a secondary prospect in general. And again, I don't want to throw him in the corner box as if that's the only box that the only sandbox he can play in, right? My first three notes here are twitchy, instinctive, and functional strength. If you're talking about somebody who can play in space with those three things, you're in for a treat, whether it's a receiver, a DB, or trying to break down in between the different positions. You mentioned the physicality. I go with functional strength there. It means he can body you at the line of scrimmage or at the end of the rep at the catch point when it's in the air. Have seen him do that in person. But then you talk about the intellect and where that plays into this. Now on top of that physical ability, you're talking about a guy who's going to turn at the right time. When that cushion breaks down, he's going to stay in phase, and he's going to play through the hands, right? He's not just a guy trying to out-rebound the wide receiver at the catch point. No, he's going to play through the hands depending on down and distance and where the football's coming in and the velocity and all of those things. And I just think this is an elite secondary prospect, a guy with an extremely high floor, again, in that idealistic, production versus projection. He's a guy that's going to be high on both scales, but even higher on that production scale. I think he is a safe defensive back recruit to covet, and that just isn't something we say about many defensive backs. I do not see a way that a Jyaire Brown enters a secondary, whether it's Ohio State or Notre Dame or somebody else's, and doesn't begin to have an impact in year one, year two. And that's just not something we say about blue bloods recruiting that position, because it usually means they got a lot of other dudes who maybe fit that same bill. But even still, with a year to go in high school, we just don't see many kids come across the desk like a Jyaire Brown. And I think he's one of the more exciting kids to talk about from a safe and high floor perspective, just as much as a ceiling perspective. And I think when it comes to his ceiling, it's about the position more than the traits. It's about where will he line up at the end of the day.
And you talk about that high floor, that he's about that safe. And we mean that as a compliment. That's not an insult. That's a compliment.
Absolutely.
You need guys like that, because if you take a bunch of projects, there's a chance that they all don't pan out. You know what I mean? That's just the reality. Guys like Jyaire Brown, who can step on, like you said, step on the field as a freshman and say, you can go win with that kid. There's no question. And he's going to have the mentality of, he's not going to be your typical freshman in that he's going to be concerned about this, or I got beat. He's not going to care. I mean, he's going to battle, and there's a need for that. Now, let's talk recruiting with those two guys just real quick. Notre Dame is in the mix for both. I would argue, based on my sources, they're in that top 4 or 5 group for both. Is getting either of them going to be a challenge? Absolutely. I think it's going to be hard for Notre Dame to get either one of these guys. They need to get one, though. And this is that thing is, if you want to make the change, if you want to take that next step, these are the kind of recruits you got to get. And I've said this, John, Notre Dame is not 7-8 guys a year away from playing with those teams. They're one or two.
No,
they're that one dynamic receiver, that one dynamic cornerback away from, you get that guy, and now all of a sudden you're not getting embarrassed by Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle, because you have a guy that can go play with them. And to me, both of those corners can be that guy, especially Kamari Rogers, just because of his unique cover ability. But both of those guys can be needle movers, which is why Ohio State went after him so early and got him, because, that's a team that knows how to recruit and develop cornerbacks. So end of the day, yeah, is it going to be hard? Sure. But these are the kind of players you have to put your full court press on, and you recruit no matter who they commit to until they sign on that dotted line and it's officially over. These are the kind of kids that you absolutely must, if you're Notre Dame, give everything you got to get, because they're the ones that are going to truly take you to that next step, not just defensively, but as a team, and not just what they do on the field. But once you kick that door down for a guy like one of these two, all of a sudden that door is a little bit easier for that next player to go through. You get a kid from Mississippi, Kamari Rogers, to come to Notre Dame, and he plays well, and he goes to the NFL, and he does well in school, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, you know what? You can be that guy. And that's the kind of thing, is they need that kind of player, not just practically on the field, but also to kind of open that door for that next player to say, hey, it's okay to go up north. It's okay to go to a school that makes you go to class. It's okay to leave the South. And if they can get a guy like that, it could have such a big impact for them moving forward, because it's different than a lot of the guys they get. Kyle Hamilton went to one of the best private schools in Atlanta. His dad is a professional athlete. Like, it's nothing wrong with that. It's just Notre Dame's always going to have success with those kind of guys.
Correct.
Getting one of these public school cover corners that they're not able to get could be a game changer for Notre Dame on the field, and then just sort of what it could do for them in future years when it comes to recruiting.
There's no doubt about it, especially with Brown, right? Because then you would be pulling from the school that has kind of built that, hey, we can go recruit anywhere, and we're not in the South footprint, which is of course Ohio State.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the school that's built the model that Notre Dame is following to some degree. So pulling from that would, I think, would perceptionally as big a win as it would be tangibly on the football field. And the more I'm talking about Jyaire Brown, I'm thinking this is a guy that we're going to begin in our nickel conversation at some point before this cycle wraps up. But going to be totally fun to break down guys like that. And when the recruitment's interesting on top of it, it just gives us that much more reason to pop the take back on and kind of check in with these prospects. So it'll be a good offseason for him. And I wonder when he will truly shut it down.
Mm-hmm. Let's wrap up with some safeties, John. This is a big position for Notre Dame. Safety recruiting has been wildly erratic. One year you get Derek Hamilton and Houston Griffith. The next year you follow up with Kyle Hamilton. And then in 2020, you get nobody. And then in 2021, you get a couple guys late that we like, Kerry G and Justin Walters. But this is a position that Notre Dame has to strike it big this year from a numbers standpoint, but also from a talent standpoint. There's a couple guys that are sort of, not top of the board, big names that I really like from an upside standpoint. Lower floors, higher upsides. And I wanted to run them by you, John, just kind of get your analysis of them so people can hear, somebody other than my opinion on them. And that is Jaden Mangum from Michigan, who's a 6'3", almost 6'4", 180, long, rangy kid that Notre Dame is, I'd say, probably in the top 4 or 5 for. It's going to be tough to get him out of state, but, Notre Dame's doing a lot more of that lately. And then the other's Devin Moore from down your way, who is from Naples, Florida. These are two under-the-radar guys that don't have the knock your socks off offer list that I see, and I say some team is going to get these guys. You're not going to hear about them for a year or two, and then all of a sudden, these are guys that are going to be starting for somebody in the secondary and going to be really productive players. When you look at the film of these two guys, John, what do you see from Jaden Mangum and Devin Moore?
Well, what I love about each of them is that they play the football well. Both, we talk about the first 3 notes that we have in an evaluation when we're just sort of digging into a prospect for the first time. If there's some kind of ball skills or ball tracking or instincts with the ball in the air, note there, and they share common ground, I think that tells you a lot. Again, we keep bringing this up. That's how you win on third down. That's how you win in the red zone. So I do think both of them are really comfortable with the football in the air. I think Mangham is probably a little bit more positionless than Devin Moore, who I think is a clear sort of old school free safety type, who you really want to play over the top and be able to sort of react and come downhill, react with space, we used to say. But I think with Mangham, I don't know where he's going to line up. He could be a nickel type who you drop on occasion, but he's also, you mentioned the frame, right? He also has this frame that makes you kind of want to say, well, let me see him at the line of scrimmage, because his change of direction is actually pound for pound probably more impressive than Devin Moore's. And then starts to make you think about other things that he could do, whether it's walling off tight ends, playing in the slot a little bit, or even pressuring from space. So I think when you talk about how fun it could be for Marcus Freeman if you get a guy like that, I think there's the ceiling there is really, really interesting, because he's just a playmaker both before and after the football arrives. Good physicality too for that foundation. I think Moore is a little bit more finesse, but he's got some corner reps on tape where, he's really technical at the line of scrimmage, playing in that wide stance with an offhand jam. So he's from, like you said, Southwest Florida, comfortable competing at the line of scrimmage pre-snap. This is not something you see a lot in Florida because kids can run down here, right? So there's a confidence there and a boundary, experience that he already has that makes him intriguing if you do want to bring him down in the box eventually. But I just think the instincts, the range, the ball skills there translate a lot more to a deep safety type, a guy you want over the top, maybe getting guys aligned in the process.
Now, first about Mangham, John, you mentioned some comments. You went towards the whole getting him closer to the line of scrimmage thing. Let's remember, let's refresh people's memory. Notre Dame just hired a defensive coordinator who wants to run a 4-2-5 or a 3-3-5 or a hybrid of those two, where the 5 is actually 5 DBs. Yep. And when you're doing that, that's the kind of guy you want. You want that he's a safety, but he's got some frame, some projectability, so you can put him in the slot and be almost a second-level defender. And that is kind of what Marcus Freeman wants. And I do agree with you. I would start him on the back end, but I'm not going to be unwilling or afraid to say, hey, you know what? This kid's put on 10, 15 pounds of muscle and he's striking people. Let's give him a shot to play in the slot, because if you can have a guy that can run and cover ground like that, a 6'3", 6'4" kid in the slot, it makes playing defense so much more effective for the same reasons we look for those same traits in linebackers.
Correct.
And then Devin Moore's another one. So you talk about he's an old school free safety. I'm going to make a prediction here, John. The old school free safety is going to become the new school free safety again here very soon.
I agree.
The reason I say that is because what is the one thing you have to do if you're with the invent of RPOs, right? RPOs kill. Cover 4 was brought to attack a lot of the spread stuff, right? So the read zone, the bubbles, you bring cover 4 because you can then get 9 in the box just as easily as you can play 4 deep, right? And so it was meant to do that. Well, then RPOs came, because if you're going to do cover 4, then we're going to RPO you to death, because we're going to throw the outs, we're going to throw the bubbles, we're going to throw the posts behind you, because you're going to come down because you see, if you're a cover 4 safety and you see linemen just engaging, it's a clear run play, you're coming down and I'm pulling and I'm throwing a post over your head. That's what RPOs do. Well, to counter that, you're seeing more and more teams look to play cover 1 or cover 3, but more so cover 1, because cover 3 has its own. Cover 3 is more of we're going to let them complete those and hope that eventually they make a mistake or we can make a stop. But the good teams are doing right. The good teams are doing more cover 1. And that means really good cover players on the outside, which we talked about, but then having that rangy middle of the field can play, from the middle of the field out to the numbers, that's going to become way more important. I think we're already starting to see it. And over the next 4 or 5 years, I think it's going to become an incredibly important aspect to being a elite defense against these teams that are just spreading the field and running RPOs and just attacking. You're going to have to play more man. And if you're going to play more man, then you have to have rangy guys who can protect that over the top. And that's what I see from a guy like Devin Moore.
I like that. And let's remember the term safety, the position was created to be that last line of defense, deeper than the deepest, keep everything in front of you, all the things that guys like me heard in Little League, and not so much as we got older. But yeah, those kind of basic principles are going to come back for prospects like that. But it's the guys who are going to succeed are going to be those guys who can scream off the hash without a moment's notice and get over the top. And there's not a lot of those out there. And there's definitely not a lot of those with that specific experience. So those developmental elements will be really interesting for secondary coaches and defensive coordinators to sort of build back towards, because we've been conditioned to 7-on-7 to where it's either a ton of zone, or as you mentioned, when you are playing man, you're trying to get, affected at the reroute line of scrimmage. You're trying to do a lot of different things as opposed to relying on that guy who is playing inside. I mean, you don't see a lot of, I'm going to play outside leverage because I know I got help inside. And if you do, it's usually from a nickel and some kind of combo coverage, something like that, not necessarily from a safety. So I love where your head's at with that. I do think that the potential for an effective role at that classic center field position is going to come back, because you have to, because it's cyclical, right? And that's what all offseason, what schools are going to be looking for if they can play it. And I think, like you said, Devin Moore can absolutely do that. We already see the range there. And again, productive with the football in the air, which is really going to become a baseline requirement for any secondary projection.
John, thank you so much for joining us. I love having you on to talk ball. We'll have you back on again. Hopefully Notre Dame keeps rolling and starts getting more and more commitments, and we'll bring you back in to talk ball. But thanks so much for joining us. If you're not aware of what they got going on there, make sure you follow John on Twitter. You can see it right there on if you're in the YouTube channel. It's at John Garcia _Jr. JR. SI All-American. Check it out. John and I are working on some things right now together. I love the collaborative effort we have with SI All-American and the team sites and the team publisher. So we absolutely love what's going on there. John, thanks for joining us. We will talk with you again soon. Make sure you check out SI All-American. Make sure you check out irishbreakdown.com, and we will talk to you all again very soon.